the ANC's support will turn out, then I think they're in for a massive success. And one of the incredible things about South Africa is that still our democracy functions. The fact that their life is not improving is a result of the fact that we have the ANC in power who are not passing policies that help people improve their lives.
The 2024 general elections for once proved just how important polling is in South Africa and just how accurate pollsters can get the polls. A lot of the politicians refused to believe what the pollsters were saying in the build-up to the elections. But what ended up happening was that the polling was correct. I remember appearing on television while JJ Tabani looked with disbelief that the pollsters had the ANC as losing their majority. But the pollsters were right. And since then, there's new life in the industry of polling and new importance to the opinion polls of South African citizens. So, joining us today, I'm very excited to have him in the studio, is Gabriel Makin from the Social Research Foundation.
Thank you so much for having me on, Mike. It's exciting to not just be a box on your screen.
Yeah, no, good. And you are based in London, but you primarily work on South African data and interpreting South African data.
Yes, exactly. So I followed my fiancée to London, but I've always worked kind of remotely. The part of the Social Research Foundation is based in Joburg. I was working from Cape Town. But with data like this, you can work remotely.
You can work anywhere. But now let's talk most importantly. It's great to have you in South Africa where you can see the reality of some of your polling, right? Especially in Johannesburg. So if you get any opinion polls about Johannesburg, you can understand why there's blood on the paper. But let's talk about polling. We because there's some exciting new polling and people getting these numbers thrown at them and getting opinions thrown at them, which sometimes is quite hard to believe because South Africa's made such a dramatic change. I want to go back to some of the behavioral or brand polling that you did. In other words, people's attitudes to certain things. And because we're not just here to sort of talk numbers for the next election, although we will get to a bit of that. But I think we've got to set the scene by discussing, the brands in terms of of political parties and so on. And we want to start off just by identifying some of the issues that were affecting the major political parties before the elections.
Yes.
Right? Because, you've given me some of the information. This goes back to 2022 and the build-up to the election.
Exactly. So what I've sent to you is a kind of what we think of are the major trends that affected the ANC and the overall electoral picture in the lead up to last year's election. And I think it's worth diving into what the public opinion data reveals, because one of the incredible things about South Africa is that still our democracy functions. And since 1994, we have held now 7 free and fair elections. And so essentially the power in South Africa resides in the people's hands, although one might argue that the people have not yet realized that fact. But to give a bit of a preface, the Social Research Foundation is established and formally incorporated in 2021, and our first poll goes into the field in 2022. The reason why we're established is we believe that there has been a general trend of a disconnect between the political elite and the conditions on the ground and what's desired by people on the ground in South Africa. And the way to demonstrate this is to have consistent, regular data in which we ask people what they believe. And we have therefore a reservoir to go to point to politicians and say, actually, you may think that this is what people want, but when we ask them this is actually what they say. So we start off with this poll that you're citing with the brand images in 2022 because we want to create an overall picture. What does South African politics look like from the perspective of the voters, not from the perspective of the analysts who went to WITS or UCT and got trained by the professors there, whose all of their political biases have then crept in. It's like, what is the reality on the ground?
And you want to get a cross section of people
Exactly, and
representative.
exactly, and so we do this, one of the biggest surveys that we ever did, which is a sample size of about 3,200 people, just over, with a margin of error of about 1.7%. So that means that every number I tell you can vary 1.7% up or 1.7% down. And we ask numerous questions. We ask questions on policy positions, which we'll get to a bit later. But one of the most interesting kind of experiments we do in this poll is we're interested in, what do people think of political parties? And so we do this word association game where I give a word like accountability or good leader, or a phrase like good leadership, or only cares about themselves. And I say, of these four parties, the EFF, ANC, DA, MK didn't exist at this point. So Action SA, of these four parties, which do you associate this phrase with or this word with the most? And the data there was unbelievable almost. This is the first poll that we've ever done. We didn't have any idea what we were going to find. It's not one of the things that people, I think, believe about polling, which is completely untrue, is that we somehow know what we're going to see when we go into the field and ask these questions. It's the exact opposite. We have no idea what the answers are going to be, and oftentimes our best guesses are the exact opposite of what the reality is. But anyway, we ask people on these questions, these brand images, and we say to them, okay, makes broken promises. Well, we try to figure out, what does the ANC as a brand represent to the average South African voter? And there's three things in which the ANC either gets a majority or a plurality. That's makes broken promises, only cares about themselves, and then anti-poor. And if you break that data down even further, majorities of the ANC's own supporters will tell you that the ANC makes broken promises, as anti-poor, only cares about themselves. So that was a stunning finding, that even amongst its own supporter base, the ANC did not have a positive image. There was no feeling of optimism that was driving people towards the ANC. People were aware of its multiple failings, and even amongst the party, that wasn't what was getting people to go there. So in that poll then, we had some other questions around potential reasons why you would support the ANC. So we had a question on, why do you support the political party that you say that you support? And we had a number of different answers, stuff ranging from my parents supported them to I think they represent my race, to I believe in what they stand for. And I think amongst ANC supporters, we saw only about 25% of them had a positive reason to support the party, which means they either thought that the party governed well or they believed in what the party stands for. You compare that to the DA, and you're looking at about 50% of voters of the DA have a positive reason to vote for that party. So they think it governs well, or they believe in what the party stands for. So now again, this question gets thrown up. So people aren't voting for the ANC out of a positive sense of optimism driving them towards the party. So why are they voting for the ANC? And the answer that seems to come out of the survey that we're talking about is these two questions we asked, which were, one, if the DA were to win an election, it's something along the lines of, if the DA were to win an election, they would try to bring back apartheid. And amongst ANC supporters, there's a quite clear majority, who think that that's the case. And then the other question was, if the ANC loses an election, the country will devolve into violence and anarchy. And again, a majority of ANC supporters believe that to be the case. So we worked out in that initial poll that we did that the voters understood that the ANC is as poor as, we understand it to be here. There's no illusions about the ANC. There's no one who's deluded themselves into thinking that somehow this is a great party. But it is also the case that outside of the ANC, the voters who were voting for the ANC were scared about what happens. They were scared about handing power to the opposition, because they think that there is some sort of colonial mentality towards the DA that, has a kind of white center being surrounded by a black periphery. People often, the DA loves to cite Johannesburg as a mark of success, but I think outside of the Western Cape, people can see, especially poorer South Africans, see Cape Town as an example of this kind of old colonial style, crispy white center, black periphery. And so they were worried that handing the power to those people is going to turn the whole of South Africa into that. And then they were also scared of, what does the ANC do if they lose power? Because they'd never, ever lost a majority before. And so it wasn't what we found right at the beginning was that South African politics was being defined by people's fear more than anything else. They were worried about what happens if we try to make a change. And there wasn't a significant, positive, optimistic story outside of the ANC for them to latch on to alleviate those fears. And I think we can maybe delve into the DA's failures on that a little bit further down the interview. But I think it's important that I paint this picture. So this is what we found right at the beginning, and when we started to poll the South African political scene.
So really, there was that feeling, and obviously, ironically, we sit here in the middle of 2025, and it's astounding to me, and I'm having this conversation more and more, and I know we should keep it about the facts and figures, how far some of those things have moved so quickly. I think that, if you just sort of cast your mind back to sort of 2022, 23, you wouldn't have thought that there'd be podcasters like me calling out the government with the kind of enthusiasm that we're doing, or people, you had the stunned silence back then. You had a murder. Nobody would talk badly about the state. Therefore, it sort of plays into what you're saying, that there was this fear of what happens. The whole thing might fall apart if they're not in charge.
Exactly. And then what's interesting, though, so, looking back at 2022, the opposition parties, so the broader opposition, non-ANC parties in the country, should be so thankful to the ANC for the year 2023 and their governance during that year 2023, because I think that the single most important issue that managed to convince voters to actually leave the party en masse was load shedding. And the completely dismal performance of Eskom during 2023 was such a clear incitement and such a clear indication that these people cannot be trusted anymore. And if I'm going to put my faith back in them, I'm asking for the electricity in my home to be cut off for a third, almost a half of every day for a year. It was the widest ranging issue, and it was the most effective at either dampening ANC support or getting rid of their supporters, because it reached into every home in the country. And so finally, people had a very practical experience. And we asked this in March of 2023, has load shedding made you reconsider voting for the ANC? And amongst ANC supporters, it's essentially a 50-50 split, that half of ANC supporters were reconsidering their support because of load shedding. And I think 5% of the people who we polled in that poll said they would not vote for the ANC any longer because of load shedding.
Yeah. And one of the things that you perhaps presciently were talking about was that the question was that both the ANC and the DA have some good people and some good policies. And, what would be your feeling of, a greater cooperation?
Yes, well, exactly. Because again, one of the things that you discover when you spend long enough time doing research into the South African market is that the people are aware of where things are going, even if they may not be able to narrate that outright, to explain it to you why they're feeling this way. And so we wanted to test, for is there any positive sentiment in the country? And the only thing that drew any sort of positive sentiment from voters was this idea of people coming together to work together. because I think it makes complete sense when you realize that there's this fear surrounding the DA and this massive well of disappointment, anger, angst towards the ANC. You think, well, if these guys come together, then maybe they can bring the best out of each other. You know, the DA can be there to minimize the kind of corruption, bad, those kind of aspects of the ANC. And then the ANC can be there to make the DA, you know, non-racist in the eyes of the voter. Um, and but this idea that coming together to work together is a good thing. That was the only piece of only question that would generate positive sentiment. It was the only thing that people could rally behind. So
that was across parties,
and then it was across parties, and we still see it today that the GNU remains the most popular kind of political formation in South Africa. It's more popular than the ANC and it's more popular than the DA because it represents this hope amongst the South African electorate that our elites might be able to put aside their differences and work together in their interests as opposed to working in the directly political party interest.
Yes, and then obviously we head into the election. The election happens, and the outcome is, as we well know what they were. The ANC loses its majority, goes to 40%. The DA holds around the low 20s. There's the emergence of Konto Wesizwe that sort of catches a lot of people offside. A slight decline in EFF, and then which leads to the formation of Government of National Unity.
Just on that point, I'd hate to come off as sounding terribly arrogant. One of the one of the organizations that I think this is what you mentioned in the beginning with the power of the pollsters. One of the things that we realized as an industry very early on was that all of the people who thought that MK was not a force were completely off. That we knew that there was a storm brewing, and that when the election day came, everyone was going to be completely taken aback by how enormous MK was going to be.
What tipped you off?
So we did in February of last year. We did a focused survey
now a few months before the election.
A few months before the election, and before we start rolling out national level polls, because we did the largest public facing election tracking poll as the Social Research Foundation before the election. But even before we were interested in this, we said we think MK is a thing. Let's do a poll in KZN. We polled KZN because we'd seen when we polled KZN that Jacob Zuma was the most popular figure in the province. In fact, in a poll that we did in KZN in September of 2023, we asked the question, can you name the best president for KZN? And amongst black voters, Nelson Mandela and Jacob Zuma were tied. 43% of black voters thought Jacob Zuma was the best, Nelson Mandela was the best president ever for KZN, and the same number of black voters thought that Jacob Zuma was the best president ever for KZN. And so we understood that there was that he was incredibly popular in his home province.
Because he had tied with Nelson Mandela and only one of them was alive.
Exactly. And, Cyril Ramaphosa was a non-entity. He was an option on that, and he was a non-entity. Cyril Ramaphosa, the differential between Ramaphosa's popularity and Zuma's popularity in KZN is basically the same differential as between Ramaphosa's popularity and John Steenhuisen's popularity in South Africa.
Oh, okay.
And so we knew that the ANC was the fact that Zuma had his own party behind him meant that the ANC was going to be annihilated in KZN, that most of their vote share was gone, and it was going to flow into the MK. So that's kind of how we knew, because we thought we said we're going to make sure that we've done good research into the area so that we know exactly what's going on the ground level, and that we don't have to therefore kind of use the sorcery of vibes, by-elections, and a general sense of the country to figure out, this is our opinion on it. No, we went and uncovered the hard facts and made our own conclusions from it.
Okay. So, and of course, just before we sort of move to the the post-election phase. Another interesting thing was that you did some polling quite soon after the National Health Insurance uh, Act was passed, which was, if for those of you who may not recall, there was a couple of weeks before the election, maybe 2 weeks, like very close to the election, where suddenly Cyril Ramaphosa, who's never been known for his swift work, suddenly found his pen and signed the National Health Insurance Act bill into law. And you did some polling straight after that. Now, this was literally in the dying days ahead of the election.
Yes. So to explain exactly what we were doing, in the lead up to the elections, we said we put a kind of a date at 6 weeks out from the election. What we're going to do is we're going to have a survey, and then we're going to take that survey as a baseline, and we're going to add 300 new and conduct 300 new interviews every day, and do that in the lead up every day, every weekday for 6 weeks before the election. And so what that meant is that we got from 6 weeks out of the election, we had a rolling average of the different political parties. So you could see we had the ANC starting at about 37% and the DA at about 27%. And you can see the effect of the rollout of the ANC's campaign as slowly the campaign kicks off and they start to bring supporters back and they move up into the 40s. And then they start, and it's very interesting to have watched this now and think back on it. Then they start really moving up, and there's a couple of weeks where every day they're about a 0.5 percentage point up from the day before, and they move all the way from 40 to 47. You starting to crest towards 50, and we're thinking, okay, maybe it's not going to be as much of a disaster. Maybe JJ Tabane and all of these guys are going to be right but these are our numbers, and they think that we are saying one thing, and we were watching them grow. But then NHI happens, and Cyril signs it in, and the day after the NHI announcement is made, the ANC is down. And a few days after you have the NHI announcement, you have the result of Jacob Zuma's constitutional court case, and the ANC try to use that as a weapon to hit Zuma over the head with. But the combination of these two things, taking a policy issue that they thought would be read as a sign of kind of solidarity with poor voters, but what was instead seen as an attack on the living circumstances of their voters, and then combining that with legitimizing Jacob Zuma's claim that the ANC is out to get me, you see all of the gains that they had made drop away. And by the time the election is held, they had been on a kind of 2-week or 10-day period of descending down. And so if they hadn't decided to take those two decisions, we may even have seen an ANC in the high 40s. But it turns out, and it's something that I think when we discuss the post-election period will become even more relevant. It turns out that South African voters are much more intelligent and much more aware of what's going on than the politicians think. And so they will not let you get away, especially 2 weeks out from an election, with passing policies that they understand attacks their material circumstances. Don't make my life worse, and if you do, I won't vote for you.
Yeah, and also shows that the voters are no longer some kind of amorphous mass.
Yes.
You get different hopes, dreams, and aspirations, and not everybody's poor and easy to read like maybe 30 years ago, or even 20 years ago.
Yes, exactly, and the ANC does no longer enjoys the kind of halo that comes out of the post-apartheid era, and they've also, you've had from the chairman of our organization, Frans Cronje, on point that he hammers home, and I won't labor again because I'm sure your listeners are well aware, so that in that first period in the ANC, first kind of 13, 14 years of ANC rule, the circumstances of the average South African improves. We've now at the point in which we're at like 17 years of steady decline. And at some point, this was going to be reflected in people's decision-making in their voting. And the reason why it's taken so long probably is because of the strength of the brand of the ANC, that it was such a, Africa's proudest liberation movement, the transition out of, racialized nationalism to an open democratic society, that there was such goodwill and such optimism behind the party that it's taken longer for that to fall away and for it to just be viewed as another individual political party than any other organization would normally get afforded the timeline.
So let's look at some of the work you did. This was in September of 2024. So,
Yes.
Government of National Unity is together. It's formed. And what were your findings there, in that period? Let's call it early GNU.
The early GNU. Well, the findings was that the GNU was incredibly popular and that the parties inside of the GNU were benefiting from the GNU's popularity. I mean, we had a poll come out in September, the poll come out in September of last year that had the ANC at 45%, 5% up from its election result. The DA had grown to about 25, but also on these numbers, a word of caution to your viewers is that as best as we understand it, we usually overestimate the DA. It's easier for us to overestimate the DA than with the other parties, but that's by a percentage point or so. So, but the big story was that the ANC is up, the GNU, everyone's excited about. The problem is that when you cut forward to this year, is that the point I made earlier, that voters are much cleverer than politicians give them credit for. Voters see that the GNU is not delivering the promises that it was meant to be delivering on. And so we're in this weird spot in which, yes, it's kind of immediately popular, but now this popularity is starting to fade away. But the idea of working together is still good, but the popularity benefit for the individual political parties inside of the GNU is essentially going to go away. And I think over the longer term, if they kind of continue to muddle along and pass policies that aren't in the interest of the average South African, that the positive sentiment will turn into a kind of anger about, why are you not unable to focus on making our lives better? So over the longer term, this kind of popularity and hope and optimism might sour and might do far more damage to the individual political parties than if they were to have just kind of stayed and tried to operate on their own. If the ANC might have invited in so much more anger because they gave to their voters at least an image that this is a realistic chance that the party will actually reform and will actually start heading in the direction which will improve my life again.
Yes. And in addition to that, you've now obviously polled that time, the post-election, and you've dealt with the issue or certainly polled the issue of the parties in the GNU. You've also polled the Progressive Caucus.
Yes.
Which I think is important to do because it's the other side, if you want to talk about it, of the South African picture. And that Progressive Caucus is the sort of loose arrangement that sits between Mkhonto we sees where economic freedom fighters, African Transformation Movement, and one or two others that call themselves progressive. If 1960s communism is progressive to you, then yes, it's progressive. What has been the attitude towards the Progressive Caucus?
So the Progressive Caucus is, I think, the questions on it are the ones to watch. As you rightly point out, the reason why we poll it is because they kind of represent the opposite end of the spectrum from the GNU. Parties explicitly left out. On the question, I think it's about 50% of voters are opposed to the Progressive Caucus, and it's about a quarter of voters will say that they are open to supporting it, that they support it, and then it's between a quarter and a third, if I'm remembering the numbers off the top of my head correctly, will say that they aren't sure about it. And we are particularly interested in that quarter to a third that are uncertain on the Progressive Caucus, because that represents their potential market, the room in which they can grow. And I think that the long term, the worst thing that probably can happen in South Africa, bearing excluding any kind of a meteorite hitting the country or whatever, uh, but long term, the legitimization of the MK and EFF for the through the simple fact that they were just left outside of the GNU and the GNU doesn't govern well enough, that is a serious problem. And the fact that you can, if you could take a combined support and unknown, it's almost the same amount as the people who are opposed to the Progressive Caucus. You can see that maybe if things go badly wrong for the GNU, there's a lot of space for the Progressive Caucus to actually eat in and become the dominant force in the country politically.
Yeah, you're not putting any numbers to that just yet, but certainly it could get pretty significant.
Yes, we've seen that that EFF and MK have polled at about the same level that they were at the election. But the thing is that when you think about these things, you've got to take what you know and try as best as you can to extrapolate it out as far as you're willing. And on this, what we've already seen is that being inside of the GNU is after the first 200 days was no longer enough to prevent the ANC from losing vote share again. The ANC was at 45% in our September poll. In February of this year, we had them polling at 32%. This, just because you're on the right side, so to speak, doesn't mean that you're going to be rewarded. And the very opposite could be true. Just because the Progressive Caucus isn't super popular amongst most voters doesn't mean that in 2 years' time they won't be more popular, because the failings, if the GNU fails, then the alternative always looks better.
Yeah, so it's a bit like that situation where you celebrate getting the new job.
Yes.
And there's celebration, you go out for dinner, the champagne corks pop, and that's wonderful. But that's no guarantee that you're going to be good at that job.
Yes, exactly.
Right. So and that represents the latest polling.
Yes.
DA, because I mean they've been in an awkward position.
So the DA is it's hard to exactly tell what's going to happen with the DA. There's many factors that could prove to be incredibly beneficial towards the DA. I think important to note, long term, if the GNU doesn't come right, it probably hurts the DA. But at the moment, the major damage is being done to the ANC, because voters are rightly assuming that the ANC is the one in charge and they're calling the shots, and it's their policy agenda that the GNU is following. And so you can't really blame the DA too much for that.
Yes.
But let's say in 3 years' time, if the DA has continued to prove to be kind of pliant and helpful and allows and assists the ANC in implementing policies that hurt their voters, then you can start to see the impact kind of hurt them. But at the moment, I think the DA will sit at in a band somewhere between 25 to 30%, and on any given day, depending on what's in the news, what battles are being fought, the DA will sit either between 25, or it will go up to a high of 30. And I think a similar effect is happening in the ANC camp, where on any given day, the ANC can land in a band between 30 to 40%. Our pollster, the head of Victory Research, Gareth van Onselen, he says, no, the band actually extends all the way to 45%, which is probably true. But given the ANC's kind of performance over this year, I'm more willing to maybe push the band slightly lower.
Yeah. And do you have any other disagreements around the date?
Yes, Gareth and I actually had a long conversation over a lot of what we were talking about, and he doesn't think that I've got the story completely correct. He thinks that I'm very kind to the South African voter, because he thinks that primarily what motivates a person, or that maybe I won't quote him and make it all about what Gareth believes, I won't put words in his mouth, but a very good counter argument that I've been given is that, you know, I'm implicitly granting the voter a very high amount of knowledge. So I'm saying maybe they don't, like, read the news, follow everything day to day and whatever, but they are able to intuit from bits and pieces of information that they're getting from, like, the radio, their friends, the social media and whatever. They kind of piece together the what's going on in South Africa, and they've got a sense of really what's happening. And then they're also able to then realize that the fact that their life is not improving is a result of the fact that we have the ANC in power, who are not passing policies that help people improve their lives. So I've got, a lot of what we're talking about here does rest on an assumption that, people are able to gather information and process it and come to a kind of logical conclusion. People, there's in academic theories around this, there's a large debate, and people will say to you, no, well, this is a ridiculous amount of information to grant the average voter. Really, the average voter what people will often say, the average voter cares about themselves and their circumstances. They don't understand all of the kind of nuances that are affecting their circumstances, and when they look to vote, you are looking for a sense of belonging. And we take this a step further now, where if we look at to kind of do a little bit of some arithmetic, where we say, I think, I hate to butcher these numbers on such an incredible show as this, but I think it's something like 60% or 65% of eligible adults are registered to vote. Of that 65%, in the last election, it was about 58% who turned out to vote. So now we're in a minority of eligible voters who vote in the last election. So we actually what this actually points to is that we've got down to the very core of the political party supporters. So I can say all of these things about what ANC voters believe, but the people who turned out in the last election to vote for the ANC are the hardcore ANC supporters. They're the people who have seen the 15 years, 17 years of decline that I've mentioned, and thought, I'm still going to come out and vote for them. And so we've reached this point, to some people will say, we've reached this point in which it's going to be impossible really for political parties to have major shifts in their percentages, because so many people are checked out of politics, and every party is down to essentially their like hardcore base, that how can you expect a person who's voting for the ANC to move towards the DA, because he's the hardcore supporter.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a fair point, but I don't think that it correctly understands the motivations behind ANC support. Because for large amounts of ANC voters, especially in the Mandela and Mbeki eras, a vote for the ANC was a vote for a moderate, pragmatic party. It wasn't a vote for populism, radicalism. And although we've reached the point at which the ANC is still down to its hardcore support, the fact of the matter is that hardcore support still wants the same things that any average South African wants.
Yeah.
And so I don't generally believe that people, like as the human beings as a species, are so incredibly ideological, especially the average person is so incredibly ideological that they'd never be willing to change their mind. I think maybe it just takes a bit longer than people might want.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned there that the factors, the issues that people that sort of affect people, and I'm a big fan of the saying that all politics is local.
Yes.
And this to me is the blind spot with some of our political parties, most notably the ANC, and that is local government. Because when you walk out and you've got a pothole in your street, or the street lights don't work, or the water doesn't come out of the taps, these are the issues that force that action, where people that aren't just hardcore, but people who are outside of the hardcore go out and vote.
Yes.
And we are heading towards, albeit a little bit slowly. About a year hence, we're going to be having our local government elections.
Yes.
And these could be, it could be a monumental day. In fact, it could be a bigger day than the last national election, because it's just that important, because our local government, the Auditor General came out with a report just a few days ago, is in an absolute mess, and a sign of anybody wanting to fix it. Are you starting to do any work on local government elections and the potential outcomes?
So local government elections are incredibly difficult to poll
Yes.
because of the kind of narrow, the geographic the geographic limitations. But that doesn't mean that we aren't doing any work towards it. While we may not do, we certainly won't do as many polls in the lead up to the LGEs as we did for the last national election. What we are seeing is that there is definitely a trend. There's a combination of the historic trend in which local government elections already have lower turnout than the national elections, and already in local government elections, the ANC is generally sits lower than it would on a national election, because they don't have the same kind of campaign apparatus and energy that they put into their national election campaigns. But when we look at the kind of provincial level data on that we've been gathering, and then in the lead up to next year, we'll make sure that we make it more explicit, focus in, particularly in the province that we're in now, in Gauteng, where we think that really the ANC and the DA, I think, let's make it something even more concrete. In most of Gauteng's metros, I think that the ANC and the DA will sit at about the same vote share. It'll be the first time in which you see across many different municipalities there's an actual race for the first position, and that's going to be an effect of a lot of the things I've been telling you about, which will motivate people who are to stay more at home. And I think that the DA are much better on their local apparatus and getting people to turn out than the ANC. I think that if we were to look, a year and a bit out, we're looking at the ANC at a total national level for the LGEs at a national average of maybe low to mid 30s, a 32 to 35% band. And in that position, almost every major metro in the country will be up for the takings if the DA is able to provide a positive campaign that can convince people to turn out. They don't need to turn out their support at national election levels, but if they can turn it out at levels higher than the ANC's support will turn out, then I think they're in for a massive success. And that throws up a whole new range of issues, because once you have the DA governing in multiple parts of the country that aren't the Western Cape, the claim that the Western Cape and Cape Town, the success of the Western Cape and Cape Town is unique and cannot be replicated, well, that's going to be put to the test, and we'll see, we'll see the tide go out, and we'll see if the DA is wearing pants. And if they're wearing pants, then good for them. That might prove to be the stepping stone that means that come the next national election, there is enough faith in the country and the ability of the DA to govern that they might be able to compete with the ANC.
And of course, the big question going into the 2026 local government elections is whether MK can replicate the performance of the national election, or exceed that, or it does what we've seen before, where new parties have come into a national election. It's pretty easy to get your name out there, and I'm thinking of COPE.
Yeah.
And when it comes to local government election, everybody says, well, look, I've voted for them almost as a protest vote, but I don't see these guys running my ward.
Yes. So It's difficult, very difficult to say what's going to happen with MK. I think that the MK is given an advantage in that they're a provincial party, they're a KwaZulu-Natal party, and in that helps you in the lead up to a local government election because all of your resources are defined in the province, all of your people are in that one province, and so all of your grassroots activists are in that one province, and so you know. I doubt that we might be seeing MK ward councillors in the Western Cape more generally, but maybe they might be able to replicate their success, given assuming that they still have Jacob Zuma around to act as the major draw card into the party. I think that essentially you can assume that MK will be stuck at the level that it found itself in the 2024 election until something happens with Jacob Zuma. As long as he's around, that's his support. That will be the party's support. As soon as Zuma's gone, it changes all of the electoral mass for MK. And I doubt that over the longer term, MK will survive, even if Zuma proves to be a miracle and can live past 100. I just doubt that the party is going to be able to get enough grassroots activists together to be able to compete and fight election campaign after election campaign in the 2 to 3 year cycles that we need to fight them in South Africa.
Yeah, well, it's going to be interesting. And of course, for the voter, especially in KwaZulu-Natal, it's not like they have to make a choice between good governance and unknown governance. They've got a choice between bad ANC governance versus unknown governance by MK, which could, in essence, could make it a bit easier for those voters to say, I'll move.
One mustn't forget that in, I think, 1994, the majority party in KwaZulu-Natal was the IFP. And I don't think that, I'm very hopeful, and I'll let a little bit of my own personal bias in at the end here, but I'm very hopeful that maybe it's not going to be between the ANC and MK as the choice in Gauteng. That over the longer term, in KZN, that the choice will be MK and the IFP, and I think under those conditions, the IFP starts to look very good. So, who knows? Maybe the breakout story that everyone will miss and not talk about until it happens is that the IFP once again becomes the regional powerhouse in KZN. It's entirely possible. So.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, the point is this: polling is a very, very important part of understanding politics. This isn't people just guessing; it's based on numbers. It's based on hardcore research, and you dismiss polling at your peril. And we will continue to get pollsters on the State of the Nation. They are the temperature gauge. It doesn't mean that is where it ends up. And it doesn't sway the vote. It's just purely telling you what the temperature is at that point in time. And at the moment, the organization that's proved it in the last election and has got the confidence certainly on this side, and that is the Social Research Foundation. Gabriel, well done for the work you've done.
Thank you very much.
Keep it up. We need that polling. To everybody, keep it up, keep watching the State of the Nation and subscribe to the channel. And don't forget to support Pace Car Rental. You can get a discount by booking your next vehicle through their website and using our code SONA. So if you haven't subscribed to State of the Nation, you're in the naughty corner. And if you haven't rented a car from Pace Car Rental, you're also in the naughty corner. So thank you so much, Gabriel. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you again on the State of the Nation. Every business needs a world-class video to show to your clients and prospective clients. When the StreamIn team isn't filming the State of the Nation, they are producing those world-class videos for companies just like yours. They have got all of the equipment, drones, microphones, whatever you need, and the technical know-how to film a proper video for your company. Visit their website.